Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Read to Inspire podcast. I am Sibongiseni Mgolozeli, your host. Today, I am joined by yet another author of the book called The Journey of Life. He co-authored this book with another author who is not with us today. We are doing part one today of this book. It's basically a collection of short stories, and I think it has about 8 or 10 short stories. Each one of them wrote about 4 or 5. So in this part one, we'll talk with Oscar Banda, who is the first author. And then in the second part, we'll talk to Farai Matondo, who is the co-author in this book as well. Just a brief about our guest this evening. I'll read his brief bio, which is at the back of his book. Oscar Banda was born and educated in Zimbabwe. He attended Gideon Mhlanga High, Jameson's High, and Chibero College, an associate of the University of Zimbabwe. He is an avid reader and burgeoning writer of creative prose, religious, and non-fiction and motivational articles. Through his lens, Oscar is on a journey of discovering the constellation of the human mind, heart, and soul through the actions of experiences of his contemporaries. That is a very interesting bio, my brother. Let me stop there. Welcome to the Read to Inspire podcast, and thank you so much for joining me.
Welcome, Doc. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome, my brother. Let's start. How are you feeling today? How are you?
I'm good, Doc. I'm good. With this, the rains, everything's just falling into place like a blessing. We are still celebrating this win by the Springboks. So this week has been.
Yeah, it's been beautiful. To us Africans, a rain is a blessing. So I love that. You see, I'm wearing a jersey, a sweater, which I don't usually you wear in my recordings. But today, because of that cold weather, I didn't have a choice. So my brother, let's start first things first. I want to know more about your background. I see in your bio you say you grew up, you were born and bred in Zim. But please share with us, how was it like growing up in Zimbabwe?
Growing up in Zimbabwe, the primary years were very nice. It was good that side. Everything was still functioning nicely. The economy, even the politics. When we were young, it was fine. But as we start to grow up, the challenges also started to come into play. And then we were forced to migrate to look for greener pastures.
Okay, we'll touch more on that as soon as we get into your book. But during those nice days, as you're saying, it was good growing up in your years, I think, as you were the youth at the time. I just want to find out, what were your aspirations growing up?
That time, our parents were encouraging us to be somewhere in life, in place of careers, and they were always encouraging us to study hard at school, so that we become, I'm sure even to them, by that time, the most careers they were putting there up, because they wanted to say, my son, one day you must be a doctor or engineer or what. This career guidance and counseling was not that wide like today, but we were striving to be somewhere in life through education.
I see. I think you're just like me, even though I was born later on in life, like before you, after you. But I didn't have my own aspirations growing up. It was all about what the parents were basically suggesting on us. It was always education, education, education. I didn't have my own dreams in terms of, like, when I speak to other people, when I ask them that question, it's more like some of them, they were against this education thing. We all had different aspirations. So I thought maybe for you, you're also one of those few people that I've met. But anyways, thank you. Thank you for sharing, my brother. Now, I'm curious, before we get into the book, the last question would be, when did you start reading non-academic books? We're not talking about textbooks here that you read in primary and throughout your schooling career. But as a writer, I'm sure there must have been a point where you started reading things like novels, poems, and proses, nonfiction work, all the personal development books you can think of. So when was that period for you, and why do you think reading is important?
Initially, I was not interested much in reading and this studying thing or this novel thing. But it was my mother was the first one who introduced me to reading. We went to our neighbors to borrow a book. I remember nicely, it was a thick volume book. And I hated that book with all my guts because why? I remember there were two characters in that book, Benny and Betty. So always I was confusing those two characters, Benny and Betty. So I usually get slapped every time. That's why I hated that book so much. But maybe on a serious note, when I was in grade 6 at primary school, there's these teachers of ours. They had a very good program there because there was no huge library at that primary school. But what they were doing in the headmaster's office, there was a shelves of books stocked there. So the teacher, because in a classroom were about 4 pupils, you could go to borrow for a week 40 novels. And then on those 40 novels, you give each one. Then the next week, you're going to rotate the same 40 novels. And the other week, and throughout the year, then that's where the interest on books started to come in, especially the novels. Because I can now remember some of the titles, like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Coral Island, the Gulliver Travels. But that thing just started automatically instilled to us the reading culture.
That's beautiful. And I can imagine, since your book as well is basically a work of fiction, would you say those novels played a huge role into, or maybe inspiring you into becoming the author that you are today?
I'm sure it was rooted, those were the strong foundations. Because the next level, when we were in secondary school, there was a proper library. And now it's a boarding school where you could rent or borrow books for a week. And you can choose. There was a lightweight selection. Then on those free periods, more like there was no free periods for us because now we're always engrossed in novels.
Nice.
And now more like the Peseta series. Maybe you remember the Peseta series that we most were reading by then. We always were competing with other fellow students to write good essays. Because sometimes the teachers, I remember in one episode, the teachers said to come together in their teachers' room to call each other to view one of the essays which I did. And then there was a reading culture, more on the novels at that school, the Gideon Klang High School.
Oh, now this whole thing makes sense. And maybe this might be related to my previous question, but I just want to find out for your book now, The Journey of Life. I'm like, to be honest, it touches on so many topics that are related. It's more like current affairs, really. And my first question should be now, what inspired you to write this book with your co-author? Or if it was a person, who was that person who inspired you to write this book?
Okay, I want to give credit to a lot of people, but what more first and foremost, this good friend of mine, Valentine. When I come to South Africa, I don't know, I didn't start to say I want to write a book in such, but it was more like an accident. Because what I was doing on weekends, I didn't have a lot of friends. Because I can say I'm an introverted type of person. So on weekends, I just took a piece of paper and started to jot stories like a hobby, I can say. And then I didn't even know I wanted to do a book in such. And then this good friend of mine, Valentine, introduced me that there are people who are forming a readers club. Maybe I know you like books. Maybe you would want to join them.
Yeah.
That's how I came to meet Farai, my co-author of this Journey of Life. And then Farai, the founder of that book club, we started to do stories, but more we're meeting every month and every Saturday, last month, Saturday of the month. And we're entering more into like competitions. So we entered a competition for Uganda. There's a Center for African Writing Excellence. They were doing a competition. And the other one, I remember, Short Day Story Africa for here in South Africa. But no, we didn't manage to win anything in those competitions, like something tangible.
Yeah.
But the reviewers, they give us good feedback that we needed that our work was good, but there was maybe we were not up there to the standard they were looking for. But we did learn quite a lot during that thing, like these things of standard manuscript format, which were foreign to us. Started to learn that when you are writing something, there's a standard you need to follow, like the indentation, the paragraphing, all those things. There's a standard you need to. We learned through that book club and through those competitions. Now, because we didn't win anything, we say, Farai, now we've got a collection of a lot of stories. What the next step, what can we do with it? That's when the idea of like compiling those things, those stories to come out with a book. So Farai had his own, and then me also I had mine. Then we came up with the 10 stories, I'm sure 5 each. And then we made that book. Now, because we're now interacting with a lot of people, that's how we came to meet our publisher from Porsche Book Company, a self-publishing book company. And she was also working with budding writers. So that's when the idea of the Journey of Life come out of that book.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. I think there were so many lessons for you, even though in those competitions you didn't win anything tangible. I mean, now look at this. This is something tangible that you drew out of that whole experience of having to enter through those competitions. And thanks for those people who gave you feedback, positive feedback, in terms of spotting your potential. And look at you now. You are authors. So I think each and every journey of your life, there's something to be learned, whether in that part of your journey you saw maybe that period as a failure, but there's always something good that even comes out of that failure. And some people don't even regard failure as a failure, but it's just, life lessons. So those lessons, in your case, they produce something tangible now, which is your book. So well done. It's a beautiful story. I didn't know that whole story because it's not penned down in the book in terms of how, the collection of this anthology came about, basically. Thank you for sharing that, my brother. And before I share my general thought and impressions of the book, I want us to tackle your sides of your journey, maybe your collection or the stories that you have written in the book. Then afterwards, I'll just share my impressions and give my feedback overall in terms of what impressed me the most. But I must say, before we proceed, you are well-versed, even though this is a work of fiction, you are well-versed in various topics: politics, unemployment, you talk about mines, you talk about a lot of things. And what I also picked, we will talk more during this conversation about what I've always heard about the education system of Zimbabwe and how good you guys are in terms of your English, the richness of your vocabulary, and so forth and so forth. So we'll touch base also on that. as well as one thing that I also picked in terms of the agricultural industry in your country. So let's start now with these short stories and the lesson that I drew that prompted me to ask these questions that you face in real life based on what I've read in your book and what I learned in your book. So maybe the first question, we'll start with your first short story, The Triumph of the Higher Realm. I love those characters, Gelson and George. Maybe you want to tell us from the beginning how that story came about and what was the lesson behind that whole story.
Okay, on the triumph of the higher realm, the story was more inspired about this phenomenon of migration, which even personally impacted me. So the story is more talking about what's really the causes of this modern migration. We know our grandfathers were migrating maybe as pastoralists from one area or region to another, but this modern migration is from one country to another or even across continents. So I was more looking on what are the push factors and the pull factors which is causing this migration.
Do you want to go into details, maybe to tell the stories of these two gentlemen, Gilson and George?
Yeah, the story of Gilson and George, they were two friends, one who already migrated, and the other one was facing challenges in his home country. And the friend was already in another country. At first, George didn't want to migrate, but it was all to do with something which was more about the push factors, some things which were not working right for him and his aspirations in life.
Yeah.
Because when we are living, everyone, we've got our goals in life. So that man's goals, he didn't want to be like a rich man in such, but he just wanted to be successful, just like what other families. But the more he's trying it, the more it's failing. So at the end of the day, he thought, no, there's no option. Everything is standing still.
Yeah.
The economy is not kicking, and there are no solutions in the end. The government looks like it's not doing enough to help his cause. So he thought, no, I must follow my friend who's already there. And because of their strong friendship, that friend was able to help him, like where to receive him when he migrated to the other side of the border. Okay. And also to help him to acquire employment and also to start life. Because their friendship was more rooted in something which was more strong. It was more to do with their religion because of their Christian principles to help each other. And I'm sure maybe the most important rule from that is you must love your neighbor as yourself. Yes. That strong bond of love. So that the friend Gilson was able to help George to migrate and also to start over a new life in another country.
Yes, yes. Now we are getting to the crux of the matter. Now we are talking, I'm excited already. You started mentioning it's all about the issue of migration. You spoke about the pull and push factors that inform this migration. And you also mentioned employment in the story. You mentioned the employment in the mines. So I want to take you back a bit before we close this story. These push factors are coming from the other side, the country of their origin, these two friends, right? So the one crossed the borders first for greener pastures. That was your phrase that you used earlier. We always want to go for greener pastures when you see in our maybe immediate surroundings that things are not going well. So the push factors, I could maybe assume that there are maybe things that are not going well, maybe political climate, maybe in one country, that propels one to go and look for greener pastures. On the other side, the pull factors could be on the other side of the border in another country, whereby there are greater opportunities of employment, for instance. In this case, these were the mines. Like you said, these friends, they share common interest, which was in religion. They are people who love God. And then now to basically summarize the story, what was the biggest lesson in this short story of these two friends? What was the ending and what was the biggest lesson that you want your reader to take away from?
Okay, the biggest lesson was to entertain the reader, but also to educate, because we see George's escapade. Then when he migrated to the other country, what he thought was going to be a bed of roses was not what he found from that side. There were a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
And those challenges were also coming from the other side, because from the other side, I was just trying to teach people on the other side that they don't know what's pushing those people to come or to flock in big numbers to come to the other country and maybe make any pressure on resources. So I just trying to push that idea of love between African brothers, the idea of, and also for our governments, because when we're fighting the challenges of yesteryears, especially colonialism, would see the Africa was helping each other. Like you would see the other countries. It was not about this country or about that country. It was fighting that evil of colonialism. So we're just showing even those governments from the root countries that they also must change their governance. They must try for good governance, so that people must not suffer unnecessary for like human-made errors. It's not like a natural disaster. It's something which can be corrected by good governance.
Yeah, I see. And you are raising a very good point. Some of the things you touch in details in the book. For instance, there's a huge role that the government can take in ensuring that each and every person who is in that part who is in their country, either a foreigner or a citizen, they must be well taken care of. You mentioned issues such as Afrophobia, and I love the term because most people, they confuse xenophobia and Afrophobia. In your book, you are very specific, because what we have seen even in reality in our country here in South Africa, sometimes what people call xenophobia is nothing but Afrophobia. Because if it was xenophobia, we wouldn't only be ill-treating, our Zimbabwean brothers or Congolese brothers, but it could be any foreigners. And this also include white people, because from what I've seen, it was always the Black people, especially from our African countries, but nothing from the Europe or the US or any other countries whereby maybe they are dominated by white people. So that's why I appreciated the terminology Afrophobia rather than xenophobia. So those are the things that the government needs to stress about. I know they try sometimes to say, okay, we're doing all we can, but to no avail sometimes. And I love what you are saying you're trying to teach through your book by saying you are trying to teach love, make people understand that we are all the same. We are all brothers and sisters. So let's put hate aside and try to understand the reason why you had to migrate. is because even natives, they understand why we are currently, or maybe why you are here. Like you said earlier, you are here for Pasture since, let's say, for instance, the situation in your respective countries are not as, conducive for you to be, maybe to live the life of your dreams. Like you said, these friends, one of them said he didn't migrate because they want to be rich, but it's all because of wanting to have a decent living like other human beings. So that's what I gather. Maybe before we move on, is there anything perhaps you want to add on what I've just shared?
Uh, yeah, that thing of tolerance between African brothers was the major point.
Yeah.
And also on the background, I see religious institutions are also doing great work. Most of the time, they are not mentioned, but you could see that giving solace to people, and also they're giving also hope. Also, I found that not everyone is nasty. Even personally, many of my friends are from the local guys. Not that thing is not. It's just to do maybe how your values and norms, how you were taught in your family.
Yeah.
It's not like every person is a bad person. No, that's not it.
Absolutely. I
And also, I just want, in conclusion, to say, in this world, this life, just like a journey we are passing. That's what inspired the title "Triumph of the Higher Realm." Because good to see after the death of George, maybe when he came, he was after material wealth, but his spiritual growth was also done after he had migrated to the other country. Those two friends could learn that no, in this life, it's just a journey where we will not be here forever. So that was inspired the title Triumph of the Higher Realm. We are going into another life after this life.
Absolutely. We are spiritual beings with a human experience. I think someone said those words in a very beautiful way. And as you were explaining the last part, I was reminded of that statement. And I think before you mentioned that, your other point as well, in terms of the church community or the religious people, they have also the huge role to play in terms of trying to fight all these social ills. We should not only rely to the government in terms of protecting the citizens or all the people who are living in that particular country. In a society, we all have a role to play. Of course, it's true that we all have different upbringings. Some people come from different families whereby they are not taught about, cardinal virtues, decency, respect, and all those kind of, good values that you can think of. And if you're coming from a broken family, you are very likely that you will be a broken human being. And those kind of people who are very hurt, they are the one who tends to start these attacks on other people. Whenever they see a gap, they are the one who are the first to start those fights. And if you don't have love within you, then it's easy to hate on anyone because it's basically a reflection of how you like yourself or how you hate yourself. How you treat others is a reflection of how you feel about yourself. So to summarize again, we all have a role to play, not only our government, our religious leaders, our leaders in respective spaces, as well as, even other part of the society. We all have a role to play. NGOs, all these organizations that you can think of, even the way that I've seen now, especially in this season of World Cups, rugby, cricket, especially here in South Africa. These are the moments whereby you can try to correct all those social ills we have experienced in the past. There are so many components or many conversations or many celebrities or public figures that we can always consult and talk to and have this conversation with, and then they can give us a way forward. And then together, united as African brothers and sisters, we can always triumph against all these odds. But at the end of the day, like you said, the higher rung at the end of the day will prevail. You seem to be well versed in many topics, basically, whether politics, climate change, education. You have ideas as you write in your book. I love your vocabulary as well. It's very rich. It just shows that, as you said in your bio, that you are an avid reader. So when someone is an avid reader, it's easy to see just from the way they write, how they communicate. Your writing skills are impeccable. So now I just want us to touch on the education system in Zimbabwe. Obviously, you were born there, you were educated there. And as soon as I was learning all these new words in your book, I was like, okay, back at Fort University, I had a lot of guys that I knew from Zimbabwe, some in my class, some in other classes. But the common thread was that those guys were very smart. And when it comes to these, okay, maybe in the test, in class, even exams, these guys were the ones who always get distinctions most of the time. And when you ask them what is the secret behind, it always goes back to the education system in Zimbabwe. And I just want to understand from you, since that time, maybe I never really got the chance, like yourself, I was shy almost the whole time in my life. So I never got to be curious to ask, okay, can you tell me about the education system in your country? Why was it so good to a certain extent that even now here in South Africa, you're getting distinctions and passing your degrees with cum laudes and so forth and so forth? What do you think is different about the Zim education system that make you guys excel the way you do?
Okay, having lived here for now, I can say maybe 15 years now, since 2007, I can do a comparison. Even my children are learning this side. So they were born this side, and they are schooling this side, and I was schooled that side. Maybe I can give a comparison on the two systems. There in Zimbabwe, I can give the plus to the government for the previous years. Maybe not now, but the previous years. All know that primary education was free. So it was financial wise, it was free for us. We just had to pay general purpose fund, but that was little money in the primary school days. And that thing encourages a lot the education to be available to a lot of children. And in the yesteryears, it was highly sponsored by the government, like education, maybe in the health sectors. They were giving priority on that. But as you go to, like me, I was schooled in these types of schools, in primary and the secondary even, I can say. Only in advanced level, I was able to go there through merit, because they did a good where my father was working, they did a good program where if you pass on your form 4s, which was the highest on the secondary school level, they could give you a bursary to go to advanced level. Then they pay for you also again. Even universities, it was affordable. And then this side, what I can see maybe, which is a problem, you have got to pay for your education, whether it's primary or secondary, and you've got to pay on a monthly basis. Whilst on that side, you pay on a termly basis, and that money was affordable. That was there. And then everyone was in this thing of being pushed to say, when you pass and you're gonna get a good life, gonna get a career. It was pushing a lot of people to work hard at school. But now the problem now coming to these years, that is in Zim, is that now, yes, there's a lot of schools and universities, and they're producing those graduates, but they're feeding those graduates. There's no employment. The employment sector, formal employment sector is more like dead, or maybe I can say 10%. More is now informal sector. So there's plenty of graduates, but there's no work for them, like for what they did in tertiary. So that is a problem again, because now the government is funding that education, but after there's no work after that tertiary education, and that thing is causing brain drain. It's more like that's push factors which is causing brain drain. Someone got a degree, maybe in medicine, engineering, or they did nursing, but they can't find opportunities. It's going to force them to first world countries now to look for those greener pastures. If the government could balance their education, how they are training their graduates, and also feeding the employment sector by creating formal employment where everyone is remunerated nicely, then it will be better.
I hear you. I hear you. Maybe the last question, while we're still speaking about the education system, before we get into the corporate or the employment part. You know, in South Africa, we have these systems whereby, let's say we have public schooling system as well as a private schooling system. And when you compare these two systems, the public sector is basically, that's the cheapest option. Where, like myself, that's where we went. And the syllabuses in these two systems are very different. Most of the case, those private schools or multiracial schools, which is basically where we are referring to them as the private schools, the quality there is very different and is also very good compared to the public schooling system. And there are so many dynamics that makes, you know, the private schooling system much better than the public one. Most importantly is the funding. That's why you find the private schools here in South Africa to be very expensive. The reason for that, there are so many activities that are involved in the public schooling system. For instance, the sport, you get to choose with a whole variety of sporting codes. They also have like extracurricular activities, like things like debates and orals, like public speaking in general. They are very big on that. They teach, you know, their learners how to communicate, how to read. They're also very big in terms of, you know, not only focusing on these academic books, but non-academic books as well. Like you've mentioned, they have big libraries, they have resources, they have like grounds, like for instance, when it comes to sport, they have all this kind of resources that you can think of. But on the other side, which is the public schooling system, there's so much lack in terms of what is available this side. And as such, it just shows when you go to the higher levels, like high school and universities. And the difference is when now you go to universities, even though sometimes the results cannot show, but when these people, maybe you put these kids together, when they communicate, you can tell the difference. This one maybe went to a multiracial school, a private school. This one, like myself, I went to a rural school from primary all the way, you know, to high school, matric. Those are some of the things that I noticed with the Zim guys. I don't know how the system works that side, but I've heard during my time at Fort University that when the exams are being set, I don't know whether the questions are set in Cambridge. Apparently, there's a Cambridge system. Can you explain how does that system work? And is it common for everyone in the country? Let me allow you to explain that part.
Okay, yeah, it just came to mind now. Yeah, when you mentioned that way, the syllabus which I did was, and for these people of my age, we were doing Cambridge. The exams were set in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. That's where our syllabus was done, and also we writing those exams from Cambridge syndicated exams. And then it only changed. I'm sure we're the last group around 2000 to write those exams.
Okay.
And then they changed now because of this politics which came into play when Zimbabwe moved itself from the Commonwealth group of countries. The whole system now changed now. The exams were now, and the syllabus now was done local. But for our group and for the older guys, I'm 41 now. So I can say maybe we're the last guys to write Cambridge and going back. And this thing, funny things which happen when exam papers are leaking were very, very, during those years, we were not used to face it because everything was being done from that side, from United Kingdom. But now, because now it's being done local, and then this bringing the standard down.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, there's still more to touch on the real issues of Zimbabwe, but I want us to go back to your book again to share another story, Heaven Revealed. At some point, as I was reading that book, because you write it in the first person, you say, my father and my mother, something like that. And then I got to ask, is this the story of your real father? Maybe you can just explain that whole story, the characters and the lessons you're trying to teach in that, maybe even the theme, like Heaven Revealed. What are you trying to teach us through that story?
Okay. Because these stories more were based on real life events, though fiction, but so it's easier for me to recall.
Okay.
Every time when I go back home, even now it's towards Christmas, I'll be going for holidays. When I meet my father, after some few days or what, you tell you about this story. So it's more like a real life story. It did happen.
Okay.
So at one point, I was not interested to go to church on Sundays. And now he was just encouraging me, say, why you don't like to go to church? This thing is very important. Do you know what happened to me? Then he was narrating this. It's like a true story which did happen.
Oh.
And then now I said, let me capture this story and share with others. Because sometimes it takes long if you want to learn from your own experiences. But maybe if you can learn from other people's experience, maybe it can help you. That's how I captured it. It's a true life story. It's exactly as it happened to my father.
For someone who hasn't read your book, do you mind retelling that story so that you can entice them to go and read other stories as well in your book?
Yeah, I would encourage them to read that story.
Okay, well, maybe we can skip it for now, but it has so many life lessons, especially about Christianity. But let me take you back now to the real issues, since that story is is basically true, but you wrote it in the form of a fiction. I want to take you back to the state of your country generally. I'm not well versed in terms of the current affairs, but I've heard there are these talks about the history of how farmers were chased out of the country during the time of Robert Mugabe. All those stories, I think they are well known in South Africa and the rest of the African continent. I don't know how old were you and what do you remember and what was your take in those principles that were put in place by the ruling party in Zimbabwe and the leader, of course. Can you maybe take us through the history of that change in the climate that resulted eventually in the sanctions by the US? What was your take on that? Do you think, what was your take on those decisions that were made by your government?
I can relate well because on the other end, I did agricultural studies, and then by that time, where I was in college, and when land reform started, we even the students using the students' body, we applied for land, and the principal did get our letter submitted to the Ministry of Agriculture, to the minister's office straight. To say, no, you are training us for agriculture and you are taking these farms. Now we've got the technical know-how. If you are supported maybe with equipment, tractors, irrigation, seed, and also the land, also if you could benefit from that, maybe you could prop up that program. But we did apply, and for sure, the principal was a truthful man. He did take that letter to the ministry, and the reply came, and they told us fair and square that you guys are too young for this matter. So that thing was done on a partisan base. Like, maybe I could say, maybe that's why it's not kicking off like the way everyone was anticipating or expecting. It was not. It was done on a through political affiliation.
Yeah.
Which party do you support? And also, not like everyone benefited from the exercise. And I'm sure maybe it's one of the causes which makes that the land reform to be more like a failure. Because I can say a failure because why Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of the SADC region in the yesteryears. Now it's failing to fill that role.
Okay, I don't want to take you back into the history of what started this whole thing, but I want us to focus on the current affairs now. In Zim recently, you had your elections, and I just want to hear from you. Did you maybe go back home to vote, and what is the current state of affairs now? What is happening in Zim? Is there hope for the people of Zimbabwe, especially after the recent elections?
I don't think for now there's hope. Because what's happening, maybe according to one of the story that I did, when anarchy reigns, I could, from that story, the same thing which transpired now. Like there's this thing of like voter apathy. Most people just feel that how does it help to put your vote once you know your vote is not counting? You really know it's not gonna count. So there's this thing of voter apathy. People just feel it's like a waste of time to participate in those. But some people vote with the being positive that something positive can come or their vote can count. But most of the like young guys, they just think now there's this development of voter apathy. They don't think their votes they count for nothing.
Yeah, even though that chapter, when anarchy reigns, is like a work of fiction, but now I get a sense that we're trying to relate the real stories that are happening in Zimbabwe, because that chapter is about even the end. I think you mentioned one of the characters there is Hector. There's just a whole lot of in the politics themselves. I think there's a new word that I learned in your book, a period of during those voting times. Is it publicity or plebiscite? Where you mentioned we're talking about the theme basically is politics, and then you were telling the story of Hector and the family and how the government tried to intervene, and the whole thing ended up even the votes being rigged in that whole situation. So by referring back to the story of the anarchy reigns, do you mean to say through that whole story, are you trying to say, based on your views, that's the reason you are basically saying there's no hope for Zimbabwe based on what you have shared in that story, because it's a reflection of what is actually happening in your country.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes.
Yeah, you know what?
Because
I think now that we have had this discussion, I'll go back to the book. It will make much more sense because I knew at some point these stories, they must be related to real life events. And by saying that, I'm going to go back to the book. I'm sure my level of excitement or maybe my level of understanding will be much better compared to when I read before this conversation. So that is to say, even people who haven't read the book, I think if you have watched this episode, you will have a better understanding and appreciation of the book now after this conversation. My brother, thank you so much. I don't know if you have something else to add before we move on to the next question.
I know we can. Okay, I was just gonna say, most people are afraid to talk about this. Even people of my generation, the younger guys, they are afraid to talk about this politics and these dispensations because they are what. But I'm just feeling feels like it's our responsibility,
Yeah.
especially as the young, I can't say young in such, but for the future of our children, we've got to talk about these things and try to find answers and rectify what we can see as mistakes so that can correct the mistakes which are being done or which were being done. Because if we just leave it like that, whose responsibility is it for to correct those things?
Yeah.
So through this mix of art, or just to pass on the message, maybe some people of my age can also learn to be active participants,
Yeah.
not just to be like viewers whilst everything deteriorates, because we are doing for those future generations to come.
Absolutely. Yeah, because now if you don't have garnered the required courage to face the system and fight the system, the same way you are suffering now, the future generations will suffer the same way you are if you are not fighting for what you know is right. So I think your call has been heard. I hope so many people are courageous, just like you are. These need people who are very brave. And even though you might say for now there is no hope for your country, but I'm sure a new generation of leaders, courageous leaders, will emerge, even activists. They will fight the system, and then what is supposed to be happening in your country will eventually come into life. It will be manifested. Let's move on now, I think this is my last question related to the book. Is basically the chapter or the story on organ demand. This was the scariest chapter that I've read, and now that we in this discussion, you have mentioned that some of the things are real life stories. I've heard about these stories about organs, people selling organs in the black market and so forth, but I sometimes doubt those stories because I never had like someone telling me or maybe seeing firsthand or maybe hearing from a close friend or relative these stories. I just want to hear what inspired you to write also this story. And also, since it's a work of fiction, did you have maybe some kind of experience of such stories happening either here in South Africa or back home in Zimbabwe?
This story was it's also based on a true story because what my writing process is like this. I'm just keeping my ears open for these interesting stories. So
Yeah.
what happened is I was working in another company, but here this side in South Africa, and this other work colleague, he just started to narrate like that story. Say, guys, you know what happened? Last during the weekend. It was on a Monday, and he started to narrate like that story as it was, that it was one of their relatives, something like that. He was injured on the back of the head through these vagrants, the people who are sleeping on the roads. Someone greeted, they were just passing by, then one of their friends greeted that man. And that man took a brick and hit him at the back of the head. And then he was injured there. But now they rushed him to hospital, but he could not make it. And then on the following days now, when they went to collect the body, because that man died, that man was opened here on the breast, like where the vitals are, the organs on the liver. Now they were asking that, say no, say something's not adding up. This man was opened here and was stitched here, but he was injured on the head. How so? And by that time, they were looking for the body to rotate throughout this hospital, being referred to, say, go there, go there. They couldn't find the body, maybe for some days. But when they did find their relative, they saw that thing. And then they had to go to these specialists. Once they opened that part of the body, the organs were gone. I'm sure, I don't know the heart, but it's a true story.
Yeah, it was very shocking when I read in the book, and when the father also found out what happened. I can imagine the trauma that happened, not only in the family, but the loved ones, the friends, and the whole community. I can imagine it was shock. So it also reminded me of how we need to be careful on a daily basis with this thing of human trafficking. You hear these stories, but since it doesn't happen to someone close to you, don't take them for granted. But these are real life stories. Thank you, my brother, for sharing that. And now, before we move to the last few questions, I just want to find out from you, is there anything else from the book or from your section in the book that you would like the viewers to know that you might have forgotten maybe or missed during this discussion?
Not really. We just see to the reader, these stories were inspired by true life events. That's what I can say. So it's more to, apart from to entertain, also to educate and to inform or what is happening in our communities.
Now this makes sense. All right, I'm going to ask you 3 more questions that are not related to the book. The first one is, what are 3 or 2 book titles that have significantly impacted your life, maybe to an extent that you also having to be inspired to be an author and write your own books one day?
Oh, the first one I would say it's Elephant Song by Wilbur Smith. I'll never forget that book because of it's more like character driven, and also it's plot driven. I've read that book maybe 30 years back, but I still can, I was like taken from this world into the world of that book. And that part of the country, I lived it for a year. So I could relate nicely to the environment. The book was to do with the people who were poaching for the elephant tusks in the Zambezi Valley. Once they took those tusks, they were exporting them to Asia to make the aphrodisiac drugs. So it was also to do with the protection of the endangered species, like these, our animals, the elephants. It's one of the book I'll never forget.
Okay. And the second one, maybe?
The other one, maybe I would say The Alchemist by Paul Silo.
Okay, that's one of my favorite as well. Maybe let me ask with this the one last question before we depart. We spoke about the conditions of your country, and in your book, you touch on so many topics: climate change, education, agriculture, current affairs, politics, you name them. I want to know, let's say you are the president of Zimbabwe one day. What would you do differently in order to make the situation of your country better?
Maybe I don't know if I'll be the president. If I become the president of Zimbabwe, the first thing I'll do is just to preach that gospel of love, love to one another, to come together as a nation, and to be united, not just in rhetoric, but also in deed, and also to encourage that culture of unity and love, and also maybe a leader who's supposed to serve the people, not to serve self-interest. No.
All right, I noted. That's a beautiful one. We have less than 30 seconds. Please tell us how much is the book and where does one get their copy?
Or the book is going for 100 rands. But on special, I can put 90 rands. That is on special. The book you can get through me or through Poshakyo Publishers.
And how do we get hold of you? Can you share your number?
083 618 0777.
Thank you, my brother. Got it. Otherwise, thanks to everyone who have watched this episode from the beginning to the end. Please help us to grow this channel by subscribing. We want to grow this community of readers. We do that in so many ways. First and foremost, we want to promote the culture of reading within the African continent and beyond. That is our mission. And one of the ways we do that is by inviting authors to come and share their stories and share how they started their journey of reading and how they got hooked into the culture of reading. So they do share their favorite books, as you have heard from my brother Oscar and the other guests who have come to the show before. Otherwise, that's the end for me for now. Please do join us next time and keep an eye open for our upcoming episodes. As long as you stay subscribed in the channel, you will be updated in terms of the developments and the other new authors who will be coming to share their stories with us in the podcast. I am Sibongiseni Mgolozeli. That's the wrap for me. Until next time, cheers.